Sexual conduct. The expectations of this church regarding the sexual conduct of its ordained ministers are grounded in the understanding that human sexuality is a gift from God. Single ordained ministers are expected to live a chaste life. Married ordained ministers are expected to live in fidelity to their spouses, giving expression to sexual intimacy within a marriage relationship that is mutual, chaste, and faithful. Ordained ministers who are homosexual in their self-understanding are expected to abstain from homosexual sexual relationships. This is the document, and particularly the sentences, that got me in a little bit of trouble.
How can we not tell Jamie's story?
We have to tell Jamie's story. We have to tell Jamie's story until things change, until we can't tell it anymore.
I think it's important to tell Jamie's story because this is something that we shouldn't forget.
I think it's important to tell Jamie's story because she's not the only one.
It's the story of a world that discriminates, a world that marginalizes, a world that is so able to treat people as dispensable.
As long as we just use statistics and numbers and statements that are just on a piece of paper without a person attached to them, that we won't get that far.
We're not just excluding a portion of the population from the church, we're excluding human beings, brothers and sisters in Christ.
To tell her story is to say that there are those of us who are struggling to change. So Jamie's story has an ending right now, and perhaps we can write sequels to her story that have different endings.
I'm hoping that as we wrestle with this question together as a church, that we won't hide the stories of the horrific things that we've been doing to people, but that rather we will accept them for what they teach us, for how they challenge us, and use what we can learn from those so that we might become more the kind of people that God has called us to be. It's not easy to talk about what we've done, but to bury that story and pretend as if it didn't happen is perhaps even worse.
And we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a justice-seeking people, and we are singing, singing for our lives.
I think when I first got to seminary, I totally took it for granted that I was married and in a heterosexual relationship, and that obviously that's accepted. But I think I kind of took it for granted just how much that's kind of held up on a pedestal as like the ideal. So much so that it really surprised me how many people get married while they're in seminary, and that it seems like you could be the most, talented, gifted person going in to the ministry, but if you're single, and we've got this person over here who's married and has a couple of children and looks very settled and then wow, then that I think is held to be more important.
My candidacy committee was overjoyed when I announced to them that I was going to be married to a man, and they were very excited.
My partner was going to be a Roman Catholic priest, and the reason he decided not to be was because to be an ELCA pastor, he would be allowed to pursue a relationship that would lead to a lifelong partnership and maybe children and a family.
It has been helpful to be a married person, to have it be known that I'm heterosexual, has been a benefit, and that's part of, for my own personal journey, part of the struggle.
And to see Jamie experiencing the oppression of not being able to pursue that same thing, to have our relationship held up as this wonderful gift and blessing of God, and living out of God's grand view for our relationships. And to see Jamie and Eileen's relationship, which is so strong and deep, and such a model for my own relationship, not held up and devalued, has been very painful.
I think that's one of the single most upsetting things about what's happened to Jamie is, here I am, and I look at this really strong, intelligent, creative, confident woman who, in all of those things is something that I aspire to be, being rejected just because the person that she's in love with happens to be another woman, and just because the person that I'm in love with and married to happens to be a man. They've given me this passport to just kind of go on through, no big deal. And then, with Jamie, it's I'm sorry, I don't care, what your gifts are. Basically she's been given this, basically they've told her that we think you're a very gifted, talented person, but, because the person that you share a bed with at night happens to be another woman, none of that matters.
When it came time to fill out my internship papers, I really struggled hard about whether or not to be out in them. I hadn't been fully out to my candidacy committee, and I thought, wow, what exactly should I do? And I finally came to the conclusion that I wanted to be out in the interviews and in the paperwork. I just listed that particularly one of my goals was to function in a congregation as an out lesbian. And I decided to do that for a couple reasons. Most importantly, I decided to do it because I have to be out. It's who I am, and I believe that it's time just for me to feel most comfortable being out, and it's the one piece that I really needed experience in, being out in a congregation as a leader. And then the second reason would be that I really believe that by having a sort of don't ask, don't tell policy, we have tons of pastors who know people who are gay, who serve, and we're gay and lesbian pastors throughout the ELCA, and then it's just time that don't ask, don't tell doesn't work anymore. And so I wanted to be honest and let the committees and the internship pastors sort of deal with that and decide if maybe they think a lesbian person might actually even, heaven forbid, bring some gifts and help the church grow. And I was really unprepared, completely unprepared for the discrimination that I faced. My heart went to my toes. Maybe it even dropped further, if that would be possible, when I looked across the table at people wearing clerical collars and saying right to my face that they're not sure that gay and lesbian people are qualified for ordination.
I had heard about the interview process, and as I was coming and going, doing my own interviews at LSTC, I would see Jamie periodically, who was waiting to do her interviews at the same time or around the same time that I was doing mine. So I'd come out of an interview and I'd see her talking to somebody about how badly it was going. And then I heard stories later, and I heard from Jamie's own mouth about how she would go into an interview, start talking, and then very blatantly, right to her face, blatant rejection based purely on the fact that she happens to be a lesbian in a committed relationship. And I think in some cases, just the fact that she happens to be an out lesbian.
One said, I can't even imagine why the seminary would ever even give us this, your name as an interview candidate. Yeah, all of the stuff that you have interest in or experience in, that's the stuff of our church, but you're a lesbian, we're not going to accept you. And that person had said that after 55 minutes of an interview where I felt excited and we had a lot of things in common. And it was just really hard. It was the first time I've ever faced outright discrimination.
The idea that Jamie would be discriminated against in this way by our church, particularly a church that speaks about grace as much as we do. I don't know. I was to find the words to describe what I felt is really difficult. I mean, I was offended. I was hurt, as if it happened to me personally. I was disappointed. I was overwhelmed with grief and concern for Jamie, because I cannot begin to imagine where that must have placed her. I know how much, or certainly some of what she invested in her preparation towards ordination, and to have it just sort of wiped out because of her sexual orientation. That's like looking at me and saying, Michael, you know, I'm sorry, but we really don't welcome blacks in this church.
And that was really hard to see in someone's face, just to have them look at you and really feel like they'd just been rejected by God and by all of God's believers. And that somehow I was one of those believers, and then I was, you know, indicted by association. And so it was really hard. It was really hard.
I was talking to her about, you know, how terrible the interviews had gone and how awful that was. And Eiley goes, oh, well, there's more. Something worse has happened. And I was like, what? What's going on? So she took me out in the hall.
The day of the interview that I was going to have with a congregation in Jackson, Michigan, which we thought was a safe site, our field ed director had to call me and say that that pastor would even refuse to meet with me simply because of my sexual orientation. He would not interview me at all. And then he took that information to our bishop. And then the process started. The bishop was then required to tell the candidacy committee.
And then when the information came to the candidacy committee that she was in violation of vision and expectations, which is this document that is defining our life together for good or ill, the committee had to decide what to do with Jamie. And technically, the committee could and probably should have voted to pull her endorsement so that she could no longer continue in the process. The committee, after much discussion, decided not to do that. They kept Jamie endorsed, and the hope of the committee was to continue to live with her in the midst of a pretty muddy candidacy process. But the committee also felt, and I was disappointed with this, but the committee felt that it needed to essentially warn her that if she chose to do an internship, if that even became possible, that the committee, with the current state of the policy in the ELCA, as stated in Vision and Expectations, the committee would be unable to approve her for ordination.
When I first heard about Jamie's internship experience and how things were kind of playing out with her search for an internship site that would accept her, I had run into Jamie outside the library, and she told me what was going on, and heartbreaking is almost not strong enough of a word. We stood in the doorway of the library and just sobbed together.
Why Jamie? Why now? Why after she spent this time? And why this church that I love, that I want to be a part of? I felt like someone in my family had hit her. And I was just overwhelmed with a feeling of unfairness.
It hurt me deeply and personally, because she's a friend of mine, and also because she is an amazing asset to this church and to the ministry of Jesus Christ.
One of my first thoughts was, oh God, please do not let her think that she doesn't have a call. Please do not let her be so upset and hurt and angry that she leaves the church and ministry altogether.
The first couple days, Jamie and I were so devastated. It's true, it was hard to even leave the house. And once we told the story to the community, it was a scary thing to do, was to tell people our grief and be that vulnerable. But once we did, it was like it wasn't happening just to us. It was like it was happening to the whole community, and they shared our pain, and it made the load so much lighter. And I almost feel like in the midst of the pain, there were these little resurrection moments where people who hadn't stood up for something before stood up and spoke their truth. And that was like moments of grace in the crisis.
we had a prayer vigil the day that the interns found out where they were going, because Jamie would not be receiving a site that same day.
Members of the LSTC student community and members of Thesis 96 came together in support of Jamie, asking her what could be supportive of her. And she shared that she needed to be present with the community and needed prayer.
Once the prayer vigil got started and people came, it went from making sure everyone was invited to just being real in this community and showing our pain, and it was really, really powerful and beautiful.
And it was during that time that I found the power of community and the power of prayer. And a safe space had been created for people to shed tears.
The prayer vigil was powerful. The witness of the community that gathered in prayer, to hear their passion for justice was empowering.
The community at LSTC and McCormick, Eiley Seminary, and even Chicago Theological Seminary, which is another cluster seminary for us, has just been amazing. I knew that people cared about the movement and really wanted LGBT people to be ordained, and I knew that I had dear friends. But I never in my lifetime have experienced the kind of deep and genuine care or witnessed my friends write incredible letters to be published in our student newspaper, or to just cry over their own ordination and be so upset and really struggling with what ordination means if their friend and sister kind of can't have it as well.
There was a day I remember that Jamie had about 30 personal letters in her mailbox. I think she got 70 altogether, and we would go out for lunch and just read them one after another. And I've never been held so completely, I think, in my own struggle, and just this feeling that we weren't alone.
And I've never experienced the kind of love, I think maybe even in my life, that I have in the last couple months or so. I've had people be extra gentle with me instead of when I could feel in myself like I was being, kind of ridiculous or weak because I would cry in the hallways, or when I would see something, it would remind me that I wasn't going to be allowed, or I had a hard time going to chapel, and instead of sort of brushing me off, people just held on to me and lifted me up when I certainly couldn't stand on my own. The experience with the community has absolutely changed my life.
This is not a situation that only impacts Jamie's own life. This is a situation that has profound implications for our whole community.
It touched me at a profound level, and to see Jamie's courage in the midst of it, I felt like that gave me courage. I felt like it uplifted me in a way in the middle of as challenging and as infuriating as the situation was. I felt like it gave me a sense of hope, and Jamie, I felt also gave me a sense of hope.
I found hope that we could gather, staff and faculty and students, in the hallway. And as we stood there to see that crowd of people surrounding Jamie, I realized we're in conflict, as some people say, between the world as it is and the world as it should be.
We went down deep into feelings of pain as a praying community. People were crying. People were just feeling like great waves of emotion. It was painful, but somehow it didn't stop there. We went through the pain and came out kind of on the other side. It ended with people clapping and singing and saying words of hope.
I think that prayer vigil was absolutely kind of a surreal thing. Just thinking about it actually gives me little goosebumps right here. because somehow there was a whole lot of people there that were really, really aching and just sad. And people who really loved Jamie so much, but then also you could tell that it wasn't just about Jamie. It was kind of like this entire cloud of witnesses that was standing around us, and we were also crying for all those people and all the brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and pastors and youth directors and whoever that everybody knows that is hiding or can't be a pastor or has been kicked out or just feels hateful or hated. And so I think that we were all there. And Jamie was in the center of that circle, but it was an enormous, enormous circle of people that was present. And then this enormous circle of spirit that was also present. And I think that's why it was so powerful, was that we each kind of had this little candle inside of us of some other people as well that we were also praying for. And it was deep, it was heavy and uplifting, and people came out of the woodwork, absolutely out of the woodwork for that prayer vigil.
For people who've never met Jamie, I would just give a big old apology, because they are missing out on not just another pastor, but someone who has exceptional gifts.
I grieve constantly for the people who don't get to know Jamie, for the hurting people who don't get to weep with her as their pastor, for the celebrating people who don't get to hear her proclaim the good news from the pulpit. Our church, our lives are not whole as long as Jamie and others like her can't be pastors.
The church is missing out on a passionate, prophetic voice, one who speaks with authority, integrity, one who speaks with care. The church is missing out on a good pastor, a good friend. The church is missing out.
I think that the church is missing out on a seriously sharp theologian and pastor who could help to shape the ELCA into the unified church that it needs to be.
You know, I actually think that in one way we're missing out on some of the blessing that God intended for this church. Jamie is a gift to this church. A gift that it seems at this point in time that we're saying to God we have no use for, we don't want. That's our loss. But it's not just this church. It's the communities that she could have reached, the people's lives that could have been transformed by her ministry.
Even though I always thought that there was a piece of me that thought I would go on for a PhD and maybe teach in a seminary, in my heart, I feel like I've been called, and like a big piece of my identity, and one of the greatest joys or hopes in my life, the greatest hope in my life was to be able to live out who I am as a pastor.
Not only would she make an outstanding pastor, but she would have made outstanding disciples. And she would have made outstanding, and she already has, and she will, undoubtedly, she will be doing ministry. But if we really want the church to be about something significant that is transformative, then we really miss the boat.
I think, in a sense, part of me died in a way with the church, in the realization that what I believe is gospel is cutting off members of our own body and saying that no, this isn't accepted here, and so I just really struggled, like, how can I keep going with this, and what do I believe, and what do I represent?
My heart is broken. And I'm angry. I know anger is supposedly a surface feeling, and I'll get to the things beneath that at some point. And my heart is broken for the church. I think right along with my own personal pain comes the pain of partly knowing Eileen's going through the same thing. My dear friends who are wonderful ministers are going through the same thing. That's just really hard. And it's also hard, though, for my friends who are allies. I don't want folks to have to go through the pain I did, and for me to think that my dear friends, heterosexual friends who are allies, or LGBT persons who are in the process are going to suffer the same sort of rejection someday for speaking out. That breaks my heart too, and it scares me because I'm just barely getting through, and would never wish this upon anyone. But mostly, my heart breaks for the church. I go through scripture after scripture after scripture, and I just feel so strongly that taking gay and lesbian people, thinking that somehow we're a problem to the church, is just wrong.
The biggest, most horrible thing that's coming out of the ELCA continuing to turn away LGBT people is that they're putting their stamp of approval on the homophobia in the society. They're saying that it's okay to be suspicious of and to dislike and even to hate LGBT people who live among us. And I think for a church, of all things, to contribute to hate and violence in that way is probably one of the most sinful things that a church could do.
To ask me what sense do I make of prejudice, discrimination, I don't. I make no sense of it. The idea that we as a church would discriminate against Jamie, I don't think Jamie a gay woman, Jamie a lesbian. I mean, it's Jamie, The idea that we would discriminate like that, there isn't a logical, rational explanation for it. We could speak about policies and constitution. We could speak about all sorts of things. But to me, what we're really doing here is discriminating against one very gifted human being who has a lot to offer to the church and to the world. So I cannot make any sense of it. When I compare that to my own journey, I've had hurdles as I've journeyed along, and I've managed to work through them. We've worked through them as a church together. It makes me wonder, what is our problem as a church with sexuality? Because this is not Jamie's problem. This is the church's problem. And I think sexuality has been an issue for the church for a very long time. And it's a shame that we're going to begin to victimize members of this church because we're afraid to deal with sexuality openly and honestly.
The broader picture is, and I've heard a lot of people say this around what's happened to Jamie, is what does it mean to be church? And is this church right now? Is it going to be church, 5 years from now or however long, when I'm done with internship and graduated and done my first call and now have the ability to kind of figure out where I want to go and what I want to do? I don't know. Right now, this doesn't feel like church to me. The prayer vigil that we had for Jamie at LSTC, where people were able to express their grief and their frustration, and we were able to gather together as a group of people who come together despite the fact that they are all different in many, many ways. That's church. And I heard Jamie say that herself at that vigil, that this is what church should be. And I really believe that. And I'm at the point right now where I have to just take a wait and see attitude. After witnessing what's gone down at seminary, it tends to deflate your balloon when it comes to how much of a difference can I make as one person in the church and in the world. You start to feel a little impotent, I think. And so right now, I'm kind of just at the point where I'm like, I'm just going to wait and see. In the next few years, see where the church is going, and then decide. Because this is not a group of people, my friends and mentors and colleagues, that I'm willing to sweep under the carpet just so that I can have a nice career as a pastor in the ELCA.
It's interesting really to think about the ELCA and what will happen if the policy doesn't change and we choose not to ordain LGBT persons who are indeed called by God into rostered ministry. And in some ways, I really believe that maybe not that much. Maybe not that much, because the church will probably continue to go on as it does, and people will continue to get a double message and things like that. In some ways, I really think that not much will happen. And that would be the saddest thing in the world. That is the worst thing that can happen, I think, is that the church will just roll around and it's sort of not acknowledging the truth, not acknowledging what's happening in society, and specifically denying care to LGBT persons who are in the congregation, to their parents, to their families, to their lovers, and most of all to their children. That the church will be denying care to an awful lot of people. And by thinking that maybe it's only the notion of, well, it's just ordination, we let them in, everything else. Well, people are going to continue to see that double standard and will sort of, I think, eventually sort of come to their own conclusions about that. Lots of people will probably stay, but it will leave a sting in their hearts that need not be there. One of the things that Lutherans are sometimes chided for is for being a little bit wishy-washy or wanting it both ways. It's that paradox, that tension that we love to think about, and that we love to sort of claim, well, we can see both sides, so we're going to kind of stand in the middle. But sometimes I think that fence-sitting that we do has dire consequences. And what would be at stake if we did ordain gay and lesbian people is that we would learn that to be faithful means to be courageous, and it means to be able to stand up and say, even at the threat of having some sort of division in the church, to stand up and say, even though we recognize a little bit of a threat, we are absolutely going to do what's right. And that would make the ELCA be the church that I believe in theologically.
If you were to ask me my hope and my vision for this church, as in respect of this issue, I would say that we come to a place where we recognize that we're all God's creation, and that none of us are able to reject another human being. I mean, the idea that somehow we can say we're barring you from the church, I don't really understand how we can think that we can do that. Whose church is it anyway? My hope is that we will come to a place where we'll really recognize that we may not understand everything about another person's journey, but that we are not really authorized or empowered by the gospel to drive people away and to bar them from our churches. And that we would also come to a place where we would be able to genuinely, not only in word, but genuinely affirm the diversity of God's creation and recognize that if God created us all different, then God in God's own self contains that richness of diversity. And in dismissing diversity, we dismiss something of what God would want to reveal to us.
One way I'm embarrassed. I'm really embarrassed that I'm going on. And I remember Jamie saying something to me about when I get ordained and joking with me, and she said, by then you will have sold out. And I was like, And so in some ways I feel really horrible that I'm going on and continuing and agreeing with this church and saying, sure, I'll get ordained. I'll let you ordain me and I'll say I'm a part of your club too. But then on the other end, I think that it's absolutely essential that as many people who love and believe in Jamie and believe in people who are legally excluded from the church have to be in the church so that that is no longer illegal and it's called inhuman and against the gospel.
I have a lot of hopes for this church, and that is why I continue to be a part of this church. There are many things like Jamie's story many instances like Jamie's that would make me, that have made me, have caused me to really want to run the other direction from the ELCA.
I have hope that because, for myself, because I've been a witness to this, that I'm not going to forget this, and that it'll keep spurring me on towards, you know, bigger and better things. And the hope is that people will keep that vision alive and will keep working towards it, and we will change the church eventually.
It's difficult, I think, whenever movements of change, I don't think they rise voluntarily out of organizations. I think there often needs to be pressure put on, and that's the tricky part. Where to place pressure, when to place pressure, how to do that. That's the trick.
So my hope would be that her story, her situation doesn't get forgotten, that it gets lifted up over and over, despite how painful it is, especially for Jamie. But the more that her story can be told and the gifts that she would have brought to the church can be mourned, the quicker I think we'll get to where we need to be on this issue in the church.
My hope for the ELCA, I recognize that for the most part the ELCA is really sort of, you know, middle class, Scandinavian, we're relatively white. We try really hard for diversity and things like that, but we kind of are what we are. And it would be my greatest hope for the ELCA that we might realize that it's not necessarily our job to consistently try to invite different kinds of people into our congregations, but it would be for the ELC to understand evangelism in a very different way that says, we need you. We need you Asian Americans, you African Americans, and I only speak in the American context since it's the ELCA, and we need gay and lesbian people in order for us to become whole. We aren't inviting you into something that is already whole, that the only way that we can be the whole and true church is to recognize that we need other people from different contexts in order to be the church.
You know, when I think about the way that we're responding to this situation with sexuality in our church and the way that Jamie's case really lifts up what our attitude is at the moment, it reminds me of the fact that it wasn't that long ago that I myself, because of my race, because of my color, would not have been welcomed by this church. In fact, not only by this church, there are many, many rights that would have been denied me just because of how different people regarded me to be. And you know, in that struggle, there weren't only people of color, there weren't only black people who were in that journey. And I thank God for all those voices, all those people that loaned their voices for my liberation, that loaned their voices to enable me to have the rights that were God-given to me. And I just wonder, if people were willing to do that then, what would be different if today we began to realize that this isn't just Jamie's struggle? This isn't just the struggle of people who have a different sexual orientation than the in-group do at the moment, but that it was a struggle of us all, and more of us were willing to lend our voice for that struggle. I think then we begin to see something of the unity of the church. I, for one, cannot but help to lend my voice, because I know that many others lent their voices for me when I couldn't for myself.
Okay, Jamie, where are we going today?
We are on our way to the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago, into the main chapel there, for what I think can maybe be called my sending service, where we'll gather together friends and stuff like that, and colleagues, and we'll have the chance to lament and sing and pray about sort of all the pain that we all feel around the loss, at least in the foreseeable future, of any chance for my ordination, and overall for all of us to grieve for the position of our church.
I am Jephthah's daughter, like a lamb to slaughter. Is this in your plan? I don't understand. I am Jephthah's daughter, like a lamb to slaughter. Was this in your plan? Help me understand. Well, I'm Jephthah's daughter, like a lamb to slaughter. Is this in your plan? I don't understand. I am Jephthah's daughter, the lamb to slaughter. Was this in your plan? I don't understand. I trust, I hope, I breathe the spirit. My clothes constrained. I try to tear at it. My heart breaks.
She has anointed my body before its burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her.
We are here. We are here.
Pour out your Holy Spirit upon Jamie and fill her with your abundant gifts of grace. Strengthen her and bless her as she proclaims your word and witnesses to your grace and love through her life in our world. Grant in all things that she may serve without reproach, and that through her work and presence your children may be renewed and your name glorified. Amen. Amen.